The first quarter of this century was marked by the Chinese economic miracle, with the Chinese GDP increasing 16-fold from 2000 to 2021. In that same year, it reached parity with the European Union in terms of nominal GDP. However, in 2024, both of these countries have rapidly aging populations. China with a median age of almost 40, and the European Union 43. But there is another distant economic challenger to Europe on the horizon, India, with its population of 1.4 billion and a median age of 28, 15 years younger than Europe. Here we'll explore what may lay ahead in the second quarter of the 21st century, one that could be marked by a new economic miracle, one of the Indian variety. First, we'll go back to the start of the century and examine the rise of China. China's staggering growth rate powered it from an economy of 1.2 trillion in 2000 to one worth nearly 18 trillion in 2023. Europe, on the other hand, faltered halfway through. Its 2014 to 2023 growth rate fell 40% relative to its growth rate in the years 2000 to 2013. While Europe slowed, China sped up. Its growth rate increased by a factor of 1.4 between those two periods. Having cornered the global manufacturing market, over the next 25 years, China's economy will likely continue growing, despite its demographic problems. For Europe, things are more uncertain. In this video, we'll examine the economic data of China and the European Union in an attempt to predict when India, if it can accelerate its growth, will eclipse the European Union in terms of nominal GDP. Using China as a model, we will arrive at three scenarios and estimate where the GDPs of India and the European Union will be in 2040. China's path to dominance after its economic opening was powered by its enormous population and was catalyzed by torrents of investment cash and technology transfers from the US and the West, who, motivated by greed and profit-seeking, has created an economic monster. In 2024, the extent of the US and Europe's industrial dependence on China is remarkable. If the old Cold Warriors of the previous century could see what has occurred, they would be rolling in their graves. But sometimes, to battle a monster, you need another monster. In a world of increasing geopolitical tensions and Cold War Round 2, will the US and the West, not motivated by greed or profit, but by an existential economic threat, help to finance the next economic superpower, India? The nightmare scenario of a naval blockade off of China's coast, the U.S. shut off from its suppliers, China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, should prompt serious thoughts about finding a replacement. That's the scenario we'll have in mind for this analysis. But back to the European Union. When we look at the GDP graph of the EU, we can calculate two separate slopes or growth rates. We'll call them M1 and M2 for periods 2000 to 2013 and 2014 to 2023. We can then calculate a ratio, M2 over M1, to represent an absolute growth ratio between these two periods. For the European Union, we arrive at a value of 0.6, indicating a 40% slowdown in growth between these two periods. If we do the same calculation for the individual countries of the EU, we can examine Europe's growth problem with greater resolution. We can see that out of the 27 countries that make up the European Union, only 9 of them have an absolute growth ratio that is greater than 1. If we add GDP into the equation, we can see that Europe's largest economies are the root of the slowdown. We also see that many of the former East Bloc nations, along with the tax haven Ireland, form the bulk of the countries in the mid and high tier. Slower growth in developed economies may be seen as inevitable, but for reference, the US, one of the world's most developed economies, has an absolute growth ratio of 2 compared to the 0.6 of the European Union. If we place these countries into growth categories and tally the total GDP by group, low, mid, and high, we find that 72% of the EU's GDP is from low-growth countries, with only 11% being from the high-growth group. The Netherlands is the only country with a GDP greater than 1 trillion that is not in the low-growth category. As a side note, we find a moderate negative correlation, an R-squared value of 0.64 between government spending over 40% and the absolute growth ratio. When more and more of your GDP comes from government spending, you might have a problem, unless you're a bureaucrat. And then we'll place the European Union in context with the other large economies totaling 3 trillion or more. Somewhat alarmingly, we find Japan at the very bottom with an absolute growth ratio of negative 0.4. The European economies all fall below 1, and India, China, and the US are at 1.3, 1.4, and 2, respectively. We can also find other similarities between India and China as well. If we overlay the GDP of China and India, staggering them by 10 years, we see that before China's meteoric rise in 2004, the growth rates of China and India were relatively similar. We can also find another interesting similarity. China's median age in 1999 was 28.4, the same as India's median age 25 years later in 2024. For our projections, we'll imagine a world where India is at the edge of the same economic breakthrough as China. We'll project India's growth over 20 years, dividing each decade into periods A and B. For the low estimate, we'll multiply the most recent slope by India's most recent absolute growth ratio of 1.3, yielding a growth rate of 212 billion per year. This would represent a continuation of India's growth trend from the past 10 years. For the second 10 years, for the B period, we will apply this factor again to yield a growth rate of 276 billion per year. For the mid-estimate, we'll use the growth rates that China experienced from 2004 to 2013 and from 2014 to 2023 for periods A and B respectively, and then apply a factor of 0.5. This yields growth rates that are 50% of what China experienced over the past 20 years. And for the high estimate, we'll use the same growth rates from China at 100%. For all of these, we will use the A rate for the first decade and then switch to the B rate for the second, projecting up to 2043. Due to Europe's demographics, the present political instability, and what will most likely continue to be an energy and military crisis on the continent, we will be less generous. For the high estimate, we will apply the absolute growth ratio of 0.6 from the previous decade over the entire 20-year period, a growth rate of 247 billion per year. For Europe's mid-estimate, we pick an absolute growth factor in the middle between Japan's factor of negative 0.4 and Europe's factor of 0.6. This gives us a factor of 0.1. This will be applied to both periods A and B and will represent a growth rate of 41 billion per year. It represents European GDP growth barely treading water. For Europe's low estimate, we set the mid-growth ratio negative to negative 0.1, providing a growth rate of negative 41 billion per year. Finally, we paired these together in a complementary fashion. Low estimate for India and high estimate for Europe, mid to mid for both, and then high estimate for India and low estimate for the European Union. Using these assumptions, we arrive at these numbers. With number 3, the most aggressive pairing, India would surpass the European Union in 2040. Due to the structural differences between the Chinese government and the Indian government, matching China's growth rate is probably unlikely. When compared with the totalitarian, centralized control of China, India would likely fall short of achieving Chinese-level growth rates. However, India's democratic system is likely to build a more resilient economic system over time, one that avoids the paperclip maximizing that we see in the Evergrande real estate crisis, the one that overbuilt enough homes for 3 billion people in a country of 1 billion and change. Despite the ability of the Chinese government to muster vast resources and apply them in any direction they wish, this becomes a liability when they point their sights in the wrong direction. For the mid-estimates, number 2, we would find India reaching a GDP that is a little under 60% of the EU's GDP in 2040. In this scenario, Indian GDP would go up by a factor of 3 relative to its 2023 GDP. Finally, for scenario number 1, we would have the Indian GDP being roughly 40% of the EU's in 2040, having gone up by a factor of approximately 2. If we examine the projected median age for India and the European Union in 2040, we find that the median age in the European Union is projected to be 47 when compared with India's median age of 34.7. As Europe's population continues to age and tax its welfare state, we could even see stronger declines in its growth rate. These are very simple estimates, of course, and the future is unknown. Regardless of what happens, we can expect that the rest of the century will see tremendous economic growth in India. In addition to its exceptional demographics and its enormous population, India has a host of advantages. India has the world's largest diaspora. All across the globe, whether it be North America, Europe, or Africa, you will find substantial populations of people of Indian descent. This connection can not only be leveraged for the purpose of trade and business, but also culturally. To some degree, already the world is comfortable with India, and India is comfortable with the world. India's democratic system and openness to debate and dialogue will be another benefit. A population that voices their opinion can help to keep their government on track. Despite the promises of McDonald's diplomacy, China's economic opening and trade with the West did not lead to Chinese democracy, but India was already there. If the West can tamp down on its criticisms of India and its preferred and increasingly common accusation of democratic backsliding, the West can further strengthen its relations with a democratic India. India's neutrality and its strong diplomatic relations with both Russia, its source of vast quantities of cheap energy and mineral resources, and the West is another undeniable advantage. If India can continue to walk this tightrope, it can not only serve to counterbalance China, but also perhaps lead to a future marked by less geopolitical tensions. Finally, there's the connection to the British Empire, one that understandably brings back memories of the horrors of colonial oppression, pain, and theft. But in a twist of historical irony, we could see the torch of the British Empire, after having been passed to another former British colony after World War II, the United States of America, being passed next to India. What India would do with that crown would be for them to decide.